Welcome to this journey into the darkest corners of American history. Before we begin, I want to know where you are right now. Are you listening to this alone in your room? Maybe driving through empty roads at night? Or perhaps you're at home, lights dimmed, seeking something that will make you question the boundaries of human nature. Leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I read every single one, and your presence here, in our community, matters. This community we're building together thrives on the unexplained, the disturbing and the forgotten. Today's case is one that historical records tried to bury, but like all truth, it eventually surfaced. The year is 1893. The place is Pine Ridge, a small agricultural community in northern Arkansas, where pine forests stretch endlessly and isolation breeds secrets. This is a time before forensic science, before psychology was understood, before the term serial killer even existed. This is a time when darkness could flourish unchecked. In the autumn of that year, Sheriff Robert Calhoun received a complaint that would unravel one of the most disturbing cases in Arkansas criminal history. A neighboring farmer, Thomas Werther, reported that something profoundly wrong was happening at the Grimwood property. The complaint itself was vague, almost embarrassed in its wording. Werther mentioned strange activities at night, unnatural sounds, and a smell of chemicals and decay. Sheriff Calhoun initially dismissed the complaint. Elias Grimwood was known as a quiet widower who kept to himself after the death of his wife Martha 2 years prior. Grief, the sheriff reasoned, makes men behave strangely. The rural communities of Arkansas in the 1890s were tight-knit but also deeply private. You didn't intrude on a man's property without serious cause. But Thomas Werther was insistent. He mentioned something else, something he'd been reluctant to share. He'd seen lantern light in the Grimwood house at ungodly hours, 3, 4 in the morning, and just once, he'd heard what sounded like a woman's voice, singing. This detail disturbed Sheriff Calhoun deeply because everyone in Pine Ridge knew that Elias Grimwood lived alone. When the sheriff finally visited the Grimwood property on October 12, 1893, he found Elias in his front yard, chopping wood with mechanical precision. The man was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his clothes stained with substances the sheriff couldn't immediately identify. They spoke briefly. Elias was courteous but distant, his answers clipped and careful. He invited the sheriff inside for coffee, but Calhoun declined. Something in the air around that property felt wrong. That night, Sheriff Calhoun couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about one detail from his visit. Through one of the ground-level windows of the Grimwood house, he'd glimpsed what looked like a figure in a chair. A woman, he thought, dressed in white, sitting perfectly still. When he'd asked Elias about it, the widower had said it was Martha's dress, preserved as memorial. The explanation was reasonable, but something about the way Elias had said it, the slight tremor in his voice, the way his eyes had darted toward the house, made the sheriff's skin crawl. What Sheriff Robert Calhoun didn't know that October day was that he was standing on property that concealed horrors beyond the comprehension of his rural community. What he didn't know was that beneath the floorboards of that seemingly ordinary farmhouse, something terrible had been happening for almost 2 years. What he didn't know was that Elias Grimwood had discovered a way, in his fractured mind, to keep the dead awake. And tonight, you're going to learn exactly what that means. To understand the Grimwood case, we must first understand the world that created it. Arkansas in 1893 was a state still recovering from the wounds of the Civil War, which had ended less than 30 years prior. The Reconstruction era had left deep scars, both economic and psychological. Rural communities like Pine Ridge existed in a kind of temporal isolation, places where modernity hadn't yet arrived, where electricity was unknown, where the nearest doctor might be a day's ride away. Pine Ridge itself consisted of approximately 40 families, most engaged in subsistence farming and timber work. The community had one general store, one church, Baptist, as was common in the region, and no formal law enforcement beyond Sheriff Calhoun, who covered 3 counties and was rarely seen in Pine Ridge itself. Life in these communities was harsh, infant mortality was high, disease was common and poorly understood. Death was a frequent visitor, and the rituals surrounding death were elaborate and deeply important. The Victorian era had created an almost obsessive culture around mourning. Photographs of the deceased were common. Locks of hair were kept as mementos. Elaborate funeral preparations were seen as the final act of love and respect. This cultural context is crucial because it helps explain how Elias Grimwood's initial behavior was dismissed as eccentric grief rather than recognized as something far darker. Elias Grimwood had arrived in Pine Ridge in 1885 with his wife Martha. They were not natives of Arkansas. Records suggest they came from Missouri, though the details are sparse and somewhat contradictory. Elias presented himself as a former undertaker's assistant, a profession that gave him a certain morbid respectability. In rural communities, someone with knowledge of proper burial preparation was valued. The couple had no children, which was noted by neighbors as unusual but not scandalous. Martha was described in later testimonies as quiet, obedient, and sickly. She rarely attended church gatherings and was seldom seen in town. When she did appear, neighbors noted she seemed nervous, her eyes downcast, her hands constantly fidgeting with her dress. In March of 1891, Martha Grimwood died. The official cause, according to the death certificate filed by Dr. Edmund Price, the circuit physician who visited Pine Ridge quarterly, was consumption, the common term for tuberculosis. She was 38 years old. The funeral was small. Elias insisted on preparing the body himself, which was unusual but not unheard of given his background. He told neighbors he wanted to ensure Martha was properly preserved for viewing. The wake lasted 3 days, which was at the outer edge of acceptable practice. Several attendees later recalled feeling deeply uncomfortable during the viewing. Martha looked too perfect, one woman said, like she was sleeping but not peacefully, like she was held in sleep. After the funeral, Elias withdrew completely from community life. He no longer attended church. He stopped coming to the general store, instead sending occasional written lists for supplies that Thomas Werther would pick up on his behalf. His property, already somewhat isolated, a 20-minute walk from the nearest neighbor, became forbidden territory. But Pine Ridge was a community where people noticed things, and what they began noticing, slowly, incrementally, was disturbing. Sarah Hendricks, a widow who lived alone near the edge of town, mentioned to friends that she'd seen Elias Grimwood in the town cemetery at midnight, kneeling by his wife's grave, speaking to it in low, urgent tones. She'd been walking home late from tending to a sick friend and had hidden behind a tree, frightened by the intensity of his behavior. John Porter, who owned the general store, noted that Elias's supply requests had become strange. Large quantities of formaldehyde, which had recently become available as a preservative, glycerin, borax, alcohol, carbolic acid, white cotton fabric. These were items an undertaker might use, but Elias was no longer working as an undertaker. What was he preserving? And then the disappearances began. In June of 1892, a young woman named Rebecca Moss vanished. She was 22 years old, the daughter of a local farmer. She'd been walking home from visiting a friend and simply never arrived. Search parties combed the pine forests for days. Nothing was found. No body, no clothing, no sign of struggle. In September of 1892, another disappearance. Clara Whitmore, 19, traveling alone to Pine Ridge to work as a domestic servant for a family. She was seen entering the town, but never reached her destination. In February of 1893, a third, Elizabeth Crane, 24, a schoolteacher from a neighboring county, was en route to interview for a position. She disappeared along the road that passed near the Grimwood property. 3 women, all young, all vanished without a trace. The community was terrified, but rural Arkansas in 1893 had no investigative resources. Sheriff Calhoun suspected robbery or perhaps wild animals. Transient workers were questioned and released. The prevailing theory was that the women had been attacked by drifters or had met with accidents in the dense forests. No one suspected Elias Grimwood. He was a grieving widower, isolated but harmless. His property wasn't searched. His name wasn't mentioned in connection with the disappearances. It would be Thomas Werther, the neighboring farmer who occasionally ran errands for Elias, who would finally break the case open, and what he would tell Sheriff Calhoun would be so disturbing that the sheriff would initially refuse to believe it. Thomas Werther had been Elias Grimwood's closest neighbor for 8 years. He was a practical man, a father of 4, a man who believed in hard work, God, and minding one's own business. But by October of 1893, Thomas Werther could no longer mind his own business. The incident that finally drove him to the sheriff occurred on the night of October 9th, 1893. Werther had been unable to sleep. His youngest child had a fever, and he'd been pacing his house anxiously. Around 2:30 in the morning, he stepped outside to get fresh air. From his porch, he could see in the distance the faint glow of lamplight from the Grimwood property. This in itself wasn't unusual. He'd seen lights at odd hours before, but this night something compelled him to investigate. He would later tell authorities he felt pulled, like God was telling me to go see. Werther walked through the pine forest, approaching the Grimwood property from the rear. As he got closer, he heard something that made his blood freeze. Singing. A woman's voice, high and melodic, singing what sounded like a hymn, but the voice was wrong somehow. Too steady, too perfect, like a music box. He crept closer, staying in the shadows. The singing was coming from inside the house, from a ground-level window. Werther positioned himself where he could see inside. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Through the window, he could see into what appeared to be a parlor. The room was lit by several oil lamps. In the center of the room, seated in a wooden chair, was a woman. She wore a white dress, elaborate and beautiful, like a wedding gown. Her hair was arranged perfectly, adorned with dried flowers. Her hands were folded in her lap, and standing beside her, holding a crank music box, was Elias Grimwood. The woman didn't move. She didn't blink. The singing Werther heard wasn't coming from her. It was coming from the music box Elias was operating. But Elias was speaking to her. Werther couldn't hear the words, but he could see Elias's lips moving, see him reach out and adjust the woman's hair, straighten her dress, touch her face with what appeared to be tenderness. Thomas Werther realized, with slowly dawning horror, that the woman was dead. He stumbled backward, his mind reeling. Was this Martha? Had Elias kept his wife's body? But no, he'd attended Martha's funeral 2 years ago. He'd seen her buried, so who was this? Werther ran back through the forest to his home. He woke his wife and, trembling, told her what he'd seen. She begged him to go to the sheriff immediately, but Werther was paralyzed with fear and doubt. What if he was wrong? What if it had been a hallucination, a trick of lamplight and shadow? What if he accused Elias falsely? For 3 days, Werther agonized. But then he remembered something. He remembered the disappearances. He remembered Rebecca Moss, who had vanished the previous year. Rebecca had been known for her beautiful blonde hair. The woman in the chair had blonde hair. On October 12th, Thomas Werther went to Sheriff Calhoun and told him everything. The sheriff's initial reaction was skepticism. Keeping a corpse wasn't illegal exactly, though it was certainly deeply disturbing, and if the body was Martha, Elias's wife, it was possible he'd exhumed her in his grief. Sheriff Calhoun decided he needed to investigate further before making any accusations. That afternoon, Calhoun visited the Grimwood property, the visit I mentioned earlier. During that visit, Elias was cooperative, but guarded. When the sheriff mentioned he'd received reports of unusual activity, Elias's response was carefully rehearsed. "I keep my wife's belongings as memorial," he said. "I find comfort in preserving her memory." Sheriff Calhoun asked to see inside the house. Elias hesitated, then agreed, but only to the main rooms. He led the sheriff through a neat, if sparse, living area and kitchen. Everything appeared normal. Too normal, perhaps. There were no personal effects, no clutter, no signs of daily life. The house felt like a stage set. The sheriff asked about the parlor. Elias said it was private where I keep Martha's memorial. Calhoun didn't push further. He had no legal grounds to force entry, no warrant, no evidence beyond Thomas Werther's frightened account. But as he was leaving, Sheriff Calhoun made a crucial observation. Near the back of the house, he noticed a cellar door padlocked. This was unusual. Most root cellars were locked from inside, not outside. When he asked about it, Elias's composure slipped for just a moment. "Storage," he said quickly, "just storage for preservation materials." That night, Sheriff Calhoun sent a telegram to the county prosecutor describing the situation. The response was cautious. Without concrete evidence of a crime, they couldn't obtain a search warrant. The prosecutor suggested surveillance and gathering more testimony, but events were about to escalate beyond anyone's control. On October 15th, 3 days after the sheriff's visit, a young woman named Alice Brennan was reported missing. She was 21 years old, traveling through the area to visit relatives. She was last seen on the road near Pine Ridge, near the road that passed the Grimwood property. This was too much coincidence for Sheriff Calhoun. The same day he received the missing person report, he assembled a group of 5 men, farmers, store owners, men he trusted, and rode to the Grimwood property without advance notice. They arrived at dusk. The property was silent. No smoke from the chimney, no signs of life. The front door was unlocked. Sheriff Calhoun called out for Elias. No response. The group entered the house cautiously. The main rooms were empty and cold. But when they reached the parlor, they found something that made even these hardened rural men recoil in horror. Seated in a wooden chair, dressed in an elaborate white gown, was a woman. Her skin was waxy, preserved through crude embalming. Her eyes were closed. Her hands were positioned in her lap, holding a bouquet of dried roses. But this wasn't Martha Grimwood. The woman in the chair was young, with blonde hair arranged in an intricate style. Around her neck was a locket. Inside the locket was a photograph of Rebecca Moss, the girl who had disappeared over a year ago. Tell us in the comments what you think happened next. What would you have done if you were Sheriff Calhoun in that moment? How would you process what you were seeing? The men stood in stunned silence. Then Sheriff Calhoun noticed something else. Along the walls of the parlor were shelves, and on those shelves were items that didn't belong in a memorial. Medical instruments, bottles of chemicals, syringes, formaldehyde, and something else, journals, dozens of them, leather-bound and arranged chronologically. One of the men opened the nearest journal. Inside was Elias Grimwood's handwriting, neat and precise, detailing dates, procedures, observations. The entry read, October 10, 1893. Subject continues to maintain excellent presentation, skin integrity at 94%. Hair remains lustrous with weekly glycerin treatment. She is peaceful now. She doesn't struggle against sleep. I've kept her awake in the way that matters. The sheriff's hand shook as he turned to the next page. It described preparation techniques in clinical detail, the injection of preservatives, the drainage of fluids, the positioning of limbs to simulate natural rest. And then came the most chilling detail. At the bottom of the page, a list. Martha, March 1891, Subject 1. Rebecca, June 1892, Subject 2. Clara, September 1892, Subject 3. Elizabeth, February 1893, Subject 4. Alice, October 1893, Subject 5. Preparation incomplete. 5 names, 5 women. And Alice Brennan, missing for less than 72 hours, was listed as Subject 5. The men ran to the cellar door. It took 3 of them to break the padlock. The door swung open, revealing wooden stairs descending into darkness. What they found in that cellar would become the subject of nightmares for generations. The cellar beneath the Grimwood house was larger than the structure above would suggest. It extended far beyond the foundation, carved into the earth itself, supported by timber beams that disappeared into shadows beyond the reach of the men's lanterns. The smell hit them first. Not decay, which they'd expected, but chemicals. Formaldehyde, carbolic acid, something sweet and cloying underneath. The air was cold, far colder than the October evening above. Sheriff Calhoun descended first, his lantern trembling in his hand. The stairs were steep and narrow. At the bottom, the earthen floor had been covered with wooden planks. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were glass jars, dozens of them, containing substances the men couldn't identify in the dim light. But it was what stood in the center of the cellar that drew their horrified attention. 4 wooden tables, arranged in a row. On 3 of the tables lay figures covered with white sheets. On the 4th table lay Alice Brennan. She was alive. She was bound with leather straps at her wrists and ankles, a gag in her mouth. Her eyes, wild with terror, locked onto the men. Sheriff Calhoun rushed forward and removed the gag. Alice gasped, sobbing, incoherent with fear and relief. While 2 of the men worked to free Alice and carry her upstairs, Sheriff Calhoun forced himself to approach the other 3 tables. He pulled back the first sheet. Beneath it was a woman's body, preserved with disturbing skill. The face was peaceful, eyes closed, skin waxy but intact. This was Clara Whitmore, missing since September of 1892. She wore a simple dress, hands folded across her chest. Around her neck was a ribbon with a small card attached. On the card, in Elias's handwriting, Subject 3, September 18th, 1892, October 13th, 1893. She sleeps, but I wake her each night. The second table held Elizabeth Crane, the schoolteacher who had disappeared in February. Her preservation was less perfect. Sheriff Calhoun could see signs of deterioration despite Elias's efforts. The card around her neck read, Subject 4, February 3rd, 1893, October 14th, 1893. She resisted sleep. Now she embraces it. The third table should have held Rebecca Moss, but it was empty. The sheet was pulled back, the table bare except for another card. Subject 2, relocated to parlor for permanent viewing. She has earned her rest. 1 of the men called down from the top of the stairs. Sheriff, you need to see this. His voice was shaking. Calhoun climbed back up, his mind reeling. The man led him to a small room off the kitchen that they'd initially overlooked. Inside was a workshop of sorts. More chemicals, more tools, and crucially a desk covered in papers. On the desk was a current journal, open to the most recent entry. It was dated October 14th, 1893, the day before. Sheriff Calhoun read it aloud to the assembled men. Subject 5 has been difficult. She fought against the preparation more than any previous. I have decided to keep her conscious during the initial stages, so she might understand the gift I am giving her. The others resisted at first, but came to appreciate that I was not ending their lives, but rather preserving them in their most perfect state. Martha taught me this. Martha showed me that death is not an ending but a threshold, and that with proper care, with proper devotion, we can hold our loved ones at that threshold indefinitely. They do not die, they do not decay. They remain kept awake through the attention we give them, through the love we pour into their preservation. Alice will understand eventually. They all do. Once the preparation is complete, once the chemicals have done their work, once I can dress her and position her and speak to her each night, she will be grateful. She will be at peace but not sleeping. She will be awake in the way that matters, held in the moment of her greatest beauty, never aging, never fading, never leaving. The journal entry continued with clinical details about the embalming process Elias intended to use. The level of detail suggested someone with genuine anatomical knowledge, far more than a simple undertaker's assistant would possess. At the bottom of the page was a disturbing note: must accelerate Subject 5's process. The sheriff suspects. May need to relocate the collection. They don't understand. They call it death, but I call it preservation. They call it madness, but I call it devotion. Sheriff Calhoun set down the journal. He knew we were coming, he said quietly. He knew, and he's gone. The men searched the property throughout the night. They found more journals dating back to 1891, documenting in horrifying detail every step of Elias's descent into madness. They found Martha's grave, exhumed, empty. They found detailed sketches of preparation techniques. They found a hidden room behind a false wall in the cellar containing clothing, jewelry, and personal effects from all 5 victims. But they didn't find Elias Grimwood. He had vanished into the Arkansas wilderness. The disappearance of Elias Grimwood triggered the largest manhunt in Arkansas history up to that point. Wanted posters were distributed across 5 states. Telegraph lines buzzed with descriptions. Rewards were offered, yet for weeks there was no trace. Alice Brennan, after recovering from her physical ordeal, provided a testimony that was both illuminating and deeply disturbing. She had been walking along the road when Elias approached her in a wagon, offering a ride. He'd seemed kind, grandfatherly. She'd accepted. He'd rendered her unconscious with a chloroform-soaked cloth almost immediately. When she woke, she was in the cellar, strapped to the table. Elias had been there, speaking to her in a calm, almost gentle voice. He told me I was fortunate, Alice testified during the preliminary investigation. He said most people die and are simply buried, forgotten, turned to rot, but he was going to preserve me. He said I would be beautiful forever, that I would never age, never sicken, never fade. He spoke about his wife Martha as if she were still alive. He said she was upstairs, waiting to meet me, that I would join his collection, and they would all be together, a family frozen in perfection. Alice described days of horror as Elias prepared for what he called the transformation. He'd shown her his journals, explaining his techniques with pride. He'd developed his own preservation methods, combining traditional embalming with techniques he'd apparently learned from medical texts. He'd experimented on animals first, then on Martha after her death, and when he'd achieved results he deemed successful, he'd moved on to finding other subjects. His criteria for selection were specific. Women in their late teens to mid-20s, traveling alone, attractive by conventional standards. He'd stalked the roads near his property, waiting for suitable victims. The isolation of the area worked in his favor. A woman could vanish, and the assumption would be accident or robbery. Never this. What disturbed investigators most was Elias's apparent lack of understanding that what he was doing was wrong. His journals showed no guilt, no remorse. Instead, they revealed a man who believed himself to be providing a service, preserving beauty and life in the only way he knew how. One journal entry from December 1892 read, "Rebecca is responding beautifully to the treatments. Her skin remains soft, her features peaceful. Each night I sit with her and read poetry. She listens. I know she listens. Death is not silence. It is only transformation, and through my care, through my devoted attention, I keep her soul tethered, awake, present. She will never truly leave. None of them will. On November 3rd, 1893, nearly 3 weeks after the discovery at the Grimwood property, a farmer in southern Missouri reported a suspicious individual camping in dense woods on his property. Local authorities investigated and found a makeshift camp containing medical supplies, chemicals, and journals. But by the time they arrived, Elias was gone again. A pattern emerged over the following months. Sightings of Elias were reported across Missouri, Oklahoma, and eastern Texas. Each sighting was investigated, but he stayed ahead of authorities, moving constantly, surviving in wilderness areas where civilization couldn't reach him. What made the hunt particularly difficult was that Elias Grimwood had become something of a morbid folk figure. Sensationalized newspaper accounts had spread across the country, and the case had caught the public's imagination in the way that only the most lurid crimes could. Some newspapers dubbed him the widower of Pine Ridge. Others called him the preservationist. The most sensational called him the collector of corpses. The attention brought out both helpers and hindrances. Legitimate sightings were mixed with false reports, attention seekers, and hoaxes. Every suspicious widower, every man who lived alone, every eccentric in a 3-state radius became a potential suspect in the public's mind. Then, in February of 1894, the trail went cold. The sightings stopped, the reports ceased. It was as if Elias Grimwood had simply evaporated. Sheriff Robert Calhoun continued the investigation for another year, but without new leads, the case stalled. The families of the victims buried their loved ones. Rebecca Moss, Clara Whitmore, and Elizabeth Crane were finally laid to rest in proper graves. Martha Grimwood's remains were also interred, this time with the dignity Elias had denied her. The Grimwood property was seized by the county. For months, no one would go near it. Eventually, it was demolished. The cellar filled in with earth, the land left fallow. Even years later, locals avoided that patch of ground, but the question remained. Where was Elias Grimwood? In the absence of capture, theories proliferated. The official position of Arkansas law enforcement was that Elias had likely died in the wilderness. He would have been 54 years old by early 1894, not a young man, and surviving alone in harsh conditions without support would have been extraordinarily difficult. Sheriff Calhoun believed Elias had succumbed to the elements, his body lost in some remote forest or ravine. But others weren't convinced. A competing theory suggested that Elias had obtained help. His journals mentioned no accomplices, but the sophistication of his preservation techniques suggested someone with more formal training than an undertaker's assistant should possess. Some investigators speculated that Elias had been in contact with medical professionals who'd provided guidance, perhaps unknowingly, or that he'd studied at some point under a physician. If he'd had contacts, those contacts might have helped him disappear. A more disturbing theory emerged from the journals themselves. In his final entries, written in the days before Sheriff Calhoun's raid, Elias had begun writing about the next phase of his work. He'd mentioned finding a place where society won't interfere, where he could build a proper sanctuary for my collection. This suggested premeditation. Elias had anticipated being discovered eventually. He'd been planning to relocate. If that was true, then his disappearance wasn't the desperate flight of a man surprised by justice. It was a strategic retreat to a prepared position. This theory terrified investigators because it implied that Elias might not have stopped. If he'd established a new location, if he'd resumed his activities, there could be more victims who were never reported missing, particularly in areas where law enforcement was sparse or non-existent. In 1895, 2 years after the Pine Ridge discoveries, a series of disappearances in rural Oklahoma raised suspicions. 3 young women vanished over a 6-month period in circumstances similar to Elias's previous victims. Traveling alone, last seen on isolated roads, no bodies found. Local authorities requested information about the Grimwood case, but investigation yielded nothing conclusive. The disappearances might have been connected to Elias, or they might have been coincidence, or they might have been the work of someone else entirely. This ambiguity was maddening for everyone involved. The families of the victims lived with the horrifying possibility that the man who'd murdered their daughters was still out there, possibly still active. The authorities lived with the professional failure of an uncaptured killer, and the public became increasingly paranoid, seeing Elias Grimwood in every shadow. The psychological profile of Elias, constructed retroactively by examining his journals and testimony from those who'd known him, painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual whose madness had roots in loss but had metastasized into something far darker. His obsession had begun with Martha. The journals from 1891, immediately following her death, showed a man in profound grief. He'd written extensively about his love for her, his inability to let go, his desperation to keep her with him somehow. The early entries were sad but comprehensible, a widower struggling with loss. But somewhere in those months after Martha's funeral, grief had twisted into something else. Elias had become fixated on the idea that death was not an ending, but a transition that could be managed, even reversed in a sense. He'd begun researching embalming, preservation, the history of funeral practices. He'd exhumed Martha, a horrifying act of desecration that he'd framed in his mind as rescue. And once he'd successfully preserved her, once he'd seen that he could maintain her physical form, his madness had found its direction. If Martha could be preserved, why not others? If he could keep one beautiful thing from succumbing to decay, why not build a collection? The journals showed that Elias had convinced himself he was providing a service. He'd written about how women in their youth were at their most perfect, and how tragic it was that age and disease inevitably destroyed that perfection. By selecting victims and preserving them at their peak, he believed he was creating something eternal, something beautiful, something that transcended the natural order. It was necrophilia, yes, but of a particular psychological variety, not driven primarily by sexual desire, but by an aesthetic obsession with death and preservation. The journals contain no explicit descriptions of sexual acts. Instead, they were filled with detailed observations about skin texture, hair luster, the precise positioning of hands, the arrangement of clothing. Elias had treated his victims as living dolls, objects to be perfected and maintained. This distinction was academically interesting to the psychologists and criminologists who later studied the case, but it provided no comfort to the families who'd lost daughters, sisters, and friends to Elias's grotesque vision of preservation. The Grimwood case, like all notorious crimes, didn't end with the immediate aftermath. Instead, it rippled forward through time, surfacing periodically in unexpected ways, each new discovery adding another layer to an already nightmarish story. In the spring of 1921, 28 years after the original events, a surveying team working in the Ozark Mountains of northern Arkansas made a disturbing discovery. They were mapping potential routes for a new state highway when they stumbled upon an abandoned structure deep in the forest, miles from any settlement. The structure was a small cabin, heavily deteriorated, but still partially standing. Inside, they found the remains of what appeared to be a makeshift laboratory, glass jars, rusted medical instruments, rotted books. And in a corner, partially collapsed into the earth, were human bones. Local authorities were called. The bones were examined by the county coroner, who determined they belonged to at least 2 individuals, both female, both young adults, at time of death. The bones showed evidence of careful articulation, as if someone had been studying anatomy or attempting reconstruction. Among the debris, investigators found a journal. The cover was destroyed, the pages water-damaged and barely legible, but portions could be salvaged. The handwriting matched Elias Grimwood's distinctive script. The legible portions were fragmentary but chilling. February 1896. The cold preserves better than chemicals. Learn this through necessity. Subjects 6 and 7 are with me now. They understand. They always understand eventually. Another fragment read, I have failed them. The flesh betrays my intentions. No matter how careful the preparation, time takes them. But their bones remain. Bone is eternal. I will learn to work with bone. The journal suggested that Elias had indeed survived his flight from Pine Ridge and had continued his activities in isolation for at least 3 more years. The mention of subjects 6 and 7 indicated at least 2 more victims beyond the 5 known from the original case. But the most disturbing aspect of the 1921 discovery was the implication in those journal fragments that Elias had continued beyond 1896. The last dated entry was from February of that year, but there was no indication in the journal that he was dying or planning to stop. The journal simply ended, as if mid-thought. Renewed efforts to locate Elias or determine his fate yielded nothing. If he'd died in that cabin, his body was never found. If he'd moved on to yet another location, he'd left no trail. The 2 sets of remains found in the cabin were never identified. They were buried in a small cemetery in Pine Ridge, their graves marked with simple stones reading, Unknown Victim, Grimwood Case. In 1937, a retired physician named Dr. Henry Blackwell came forward with information he'd kept secret for over 40 years. Dr. Blackwell was 83 years old and dying of cancer. He told his son that he had information about the Grimwood case that he needed to confess before his death. What Dr. Blackwell revealed was explosive. In 1892, he had been a young doctor recently graduated from medical school, working in St. Louis, Missouri. He'd received a letter from someone identifying himself as a private researcher interested in preservation techniques. The letter writer had specific questions about embalming, chemical preservation, and human anatomy. Dr. Blackwell, eager to demonstrate his knowledge and flattered by the attention, had responded with detailed information. Over several months, he'd corresponded with this researcher, providing increasingly technical guidance. He'd even sent copies of medical texts and diagrams. The correspondence had stopped abruptly in October 1893. Dr. Blackwell thought nothing of it until he read newspaper accounts of the Pine Ridge discoveries. With growing horror, he'd realized that his correspondent had been Elias Grimwood. Dr. Blackwell never came forward at the time because he feared prosecution as an accessory. He'd destroyed the letters and tried to forget his unwitting role in the crimes, but the guilt had haunted him for decades. His son turned over the few letters Dr. Blackwell had kept, 3 that he'd hidden away, unable to destroy completely. These letters, written in Elias's hand, showed a man who was methodical, intelligent, and utterly devoid of moral comprehension. He'd asked his questions with scientific detachment, never revealing his true intentions. One letter, dated August 1892, contained a question that, in retrospect, was horrifying. In your professional opinion, Dr. Blackwell, what is the maximum duration a properly preserved human specimen could be maintained in a presentable state using formaldehyde-based compounds? I am, of course, referring to post-mortem preservation for extended viewing purposes. Dr. Blackwell had answered professionally, discussing techniques used in medical schools for anatomical specimens. He'd provided the information that Elias had then used to torture and preserve his victims. The revelation that Elias had sought and received professional guidance added another dimension to the case. He hadn't been a simple madman acting on instinct. He'd been educated, methodical, constantly seeking to improve his techniques. Perhaps the most unsettling development in the Grimwood case came in 1954, 61 years after the original crimes. A historical society in Little Rock, Arkansas, received a donation of old photographs from an estate sale. The collection was mostly mundane: family portraits, landscape shots, typical late 19th and early 20th century images. But one photograph stood out. It was undated but appeared to have been taken around 1900 based on the photographic technique and the clothing visible in the image. The photograph showed a man standing in front of a small wooden structure, possibly a cabin or workshop. The man was elderly, perhaps in his 60s, with a full beard and intense eyes. In his hands, he held what appeared to be a human skull. The photograph had no identifying information on the front, but on the back, written in faded pencil, were 3 words: Elias, still working. The handwriting was analyzed and compared to known samples. It didn't match Elias's writing, suggesting someone else had written the caption. But the man in the photograph bore a resemblance to descriptions of Elias Grimwood from the 1890s, allowing for age. If the photograph was genuine, and if the man in it was indeed Elias, then he'd survived well into his 60s, possibly his 70s. He'd have been approximately 61 years old in 1900, and the caption, "Still working," implied he'd never stopped. The photograph was published in several newspapers with requests for information. Some claimed to recognize the location in the background, placing it variously in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. None of the tips led anywhere conclusive. Experts have debated the photograph's authenticity for decades. Some believe it's genuine, proof that Elias Grimwood survived far longer than authorities believed. Others think it's a hoax, created by someone familiar with the case. Still others suggest it might be Elias, but the caption could have been added later by someone who didn't actually know him, a piece of morbid folklore rather than documentation. In 1963, 70 years after the Pine Ridge discoveries, a woman named Emma Pritchard, aged 91, gave a deathbed confession that added one final chilling note to the Grimwood saga. Emma had been a resident of Pine Ridge as a young woman. She'd been 21 years old in 1893, the same age as many of Elias's victims. But Emma had survived the period, married, moved away, and lived a long life. On her deathbed, she told her granddaughter something she'd never told anyone. Elias Grimwood had approached her. It had been in the summer of 1893, a few months before his exposure. Emma had been walking alone, returning from visiting a friend. Elias had appeared on the road, offered her a ride in his wagon. Something about him had frightened her instantly. She couldn't articulate what, just an instinctive feeling of wrongness. She'd declined politely and hurried away. Elias hadn't pursued or insisted. He'd simply watched her go, and Emma had felt his eyes on her back the entire time she walked. She'd never reported the encounter because nothing had actually happened. But when the news of Elias's crimes broke months later, Emma had been overwhelmed by the realization of how close she'd come to becoming Subject 5 instead of Alice Brennan. "I think about those girls all the time," Emma told her granddaughter. "I think about how it could have been me in that cellar, preserved like some grotesque doll. I think about Rebecca and Clara and Elizabeth, and I wonder how many others there were that we never found. How many girls said yes when I said no? How many accepted rides from a kind-looking old man and were never seen again?" Emma Pritchard's testimony was recorded and added to the historical archive. It served as a reminder that for every known victim, there might be unknown ones, shadows in the historical record, women who vanished and were never connected to Elias Grimwood because their disappearances occurred in the wrong place or the wrong time for anyone to notice. The Grimwood case file was never officially closed. It remains to this day listed as an open investigation, though no active work has been done on it since the 1960s. So, what are we left with all these decades later? The Grimwood case remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. We know Elias Grimwood killed at least 5 women, possibly 7, possibly more. We know he preserved their bodies in a grotesque parody of devotion. We know he evaded capture and disappeared into the wilderness of the American frontier. But we don't know when he died, or where, or whether he continued his crimes until the very end. 3 main theories have emerged over the years, and I want to present them to you without bias, because the truth is, we may never know which is correct. Theory 1. Death in the wilderness. This is the official law enforcement position from 1894 onward. Elias Grimwood, a man in his mid-50s, fled into harsh wilderness without adequate supplies or support. The winter of 1893-1894 was particularly brutal in the Ozark region. Exposure, starvation, injury, illness, any of these could have killed him within weeks or months of his flight. His body was simply never found, lost in some remote ravine or cave, reclaimed by the forest. This theory has the virtue of simplicity and the weight of statistical probability. Most fugitives don't survive long in genuine wilderness, especially in the 19th century, without modern survival gear. But it doesn't account for the 1921 journal fragments or the 1954 photograph or the consistent pattern of disappearances that continued in the region for years after 1893. Theory 2. Continued killings until natural death. This theory posits that Elias survived his flight, established new hiding places, like the cabin found in 1921, and continued selecting victims for years, possibly decades. The journal fragments suggest he was active until at least 1896. The photograph might place him alive in 1900 or later. If he was physically and mentally capable, there's no reason to think he would have stopped voluntarily. This theory is supported by the evidence of continued activity, but it raises disturbing questions. How many more victims were there? Where are they buried? Did Elias's techniques evolve, or did he eventually abandon preservation in favor of simpler disposal methods? If this theory is correct, Elias Grimwood wasn't just a murderer. He was one of America's most prolific serial killers, operating before the term even existed, his true victim count lost to history. Theory 3. Escape and reinvention. The most controversial theory suggests that Elias successfully escaped the region entirely and reinvented himself somewhere far from Arkansas. Perhaps he moved to a city, changed his name, and lived out his years anonymously. Perhaps he even resumed a normal life, his murderous impulses either sated or controlled. This theory is dismissed by most serious researchers because it requires believing that someone with Elias's level of compulsion could simply stop. The psychological profile suggests someone who wouldn't cease voluntarily, but it's not impossible. Some serial killers have stopped, whether through fear of capture, physical inability, or genuine psychological change. If Elias did reinvent himself, he might have died in old age, in a city hospital somewhere, under a false name, his crimes never connected to the kindly old man in the next bed. The truth is, we'll probably never know. What we do know is that the Grimwood case changed how rural communities thought about safety. After 1893, the myth of the safe countryside was shattered. Evil, it turned out, didn't just lurk in cities. It could flourish anywhere isolation and opportunity intersected. The case also highlighted the limitations of 19th century law enforcement. In an era before fingerprinting, forensic science, coordinated interstate communication, and modern investigative techniques, a determined individual could vanish with relative ease. Elias Grimwood slipped through gaps that simply don't exist anymore. But perhaps most significantly, the Grimwood case became a cautionary tale about the line between devotion and obsession, between love and possession, between grief and madness. Elias claimed to love the women he killed. He claimed to be preserving them, honoring them, keeping them from the decay that awaits all flesh. But love doesn't bind, love doesn't trap, love doesn't kill and preserve. What Elias Grimwood felt was possession taken to its ultimate extreme, the desire to own another human being so completely that even death couldn't separate them. It was the antithesis of love, dressed in love's language, justified through love's vocabulary. To this day, in northern Arkansas, in the area where Pine Ridge once stood, locals still avoid certain patches of forest. They still tell stories about the widower of Pine Ridge, about the man who kept the dead awake, about the women whose graves were never found. And on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the pines, some claim you can still hear singing, high and melodic, too perfect, too steady, like a music box playing in an empty room. Whether that's truth or folklore, I'll leave for you to decide. Before you go, I need to ask you something. What theory do you believe? Do you think Elias died, and quickly in the wilderness, or do you think he survived and continued his horrors for years? Do you think there are more victims we never found? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your theories, your insights, they're what make this community what it is. If this story affected you, if it made you think, if it disturbed you in ways you can't quite articulate, then please subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell. Join us here in our haunted community, where we don't shy away from the darkest corners of history, because these stories need to be told. These victims need to be remembered. And who knows, maybe someone out there has information, has heard a family story, has seen something in an old archive that could finally close this case after more than a century. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, history's greatest monsters were once just people, walking among us, looking perfectly ordinary, until the moment they weren't.